Nelson Mandela would spend 27 of his 95 years of life in prison. When the ska revival band The Specials, under the name The Special AKA, released Nelson Mandela in 1984, he had already been in prison in apartheid South Africa for over 20 years, and it would be another 6 years before he saw his release. He became the father of the modern democratic South Africa, bringing an end to apartheid and becoming the first black head of state in South Africa. Winner of the 1993 Nobel Peace Prize, Mandela became a revered figure worldwide. He is credited with saying, "I never lose. I either win or learn." This mindset of growth and a redefining of failure is a key to accelerating performance and innovation, says Neil Pretty, the CEO of Aristotle Performance. This week on Next in Q, we discuss how leaders create psychological safety and trust, what corporations can learn from the military, the key conditions for driving innovation among teams, why leaders often default to managing, and one simple strategy to improve your leadership presence. Let's get to it.
Welcome to Next in Q, the podcast for contact center and customer experience professionals. Next in Q is brought to you by Happy 2 Vision. Eliminate blind spots and see right through every conversation with Happy 2 Vision. Learn more at happitu.com. Now, here's your host, Rob Dwyer.
Hey everyone, appreciate you joining another episode of Next in Q. This week, I am joined by Neil Pretty. Neil, how are you?
I'm fantastic. It's a beautiful sunny day, so how could I be bad?
Yeah, so we have to just start from one man with some facial hair to another man with some facial hair. You've got something really going on here. So let's start the history by the history of your facial hair. I'm really excited to start off the pod that way.
Well, it's sort of funny because I used to have long, like shoulder length, past my shoulder length hair. And then as I moved into this sort of industry, it's like, well, nobody's going to take me seriously if I have long hair, so I better cut it all off. So I kind of did that. And it was sort of coincided with me becoming a dad as well. So that happened. And then a friend of mine at a party was like, you don't look quite right. She's like, you would look really good with a mustache that was turned up like this. And she was, she'd had a few and she was entertaining. I said, you bet, I'm going to do it. Dare accepted, and it sort of started off really as a joke. And then it stuck. And I was in the development of my first website at that point, and people were starting to get to know me in their career transformation and leadership development space. And I kind of stuck. So I've always said since then that you'll know I've really made it when I can shave it off.
Yeah. Well, some of us are jealous that you made a decision to cut your long hair off because some of us had that decision made for us a long time ago. So let's transition our follically focused conversation over to what you're doing today. Give us a little bit of background about kind of how you got into the work that you're doing today and what exactly that is.
Yeah, so I'm the CEO of a company called Aristotle Performance, and we help leaders, teams, and organizations develop psychological safety and trust and build learning behaviors, all in the name of performance and effectiveness, innovation. So we work at that individual level. We work also at the team level and the organizational level. But my journey to that actually, it's interesting because I realized the other day that I actually hadn't shared this story in quite a while, but my first leadership position was actually at the age of 13 in Army cadets. And I'll never forget that moment because I was given a section with an opportunity to lead in a paramilitary organization, and that uh, typical hierarchical command and control structure. And the first thing I did was got everybody to grab a seat. We all sat down, and I said, how do we want to be as a section together? And I was promptly stood up by my platoon commander and taken outside and yelled at. So being a little bit of the cantankerous SOB that I was at the time, I went back inside and stood up like I was told to, and then just repeated the same question. How do we want to be as a group? Because what they wanted me to do was tell everyone how it was going to be. And over the ensuing years, which culminated in leading north of 300 teams. And I have done the math. It was actually, somebody actually pointed out to me, like, you should do the math on how many teams you've actually led. So by the time I was in my early 30s, I'd traveled all over North America, leading hundreds of teams, often, 4 to 6 or 8 in a night. And we would work together in these very high pace, very high stress, short communication. And I also had an intact team that I traveled with. And I worked in several other domains. I'd been an entrepreneur. I didn't even know what an entrepreneur was, and I'd had 7 businesses, and this is my 7th business, I should say. And all of that culminated to a point in my life where the opportunity to develop myself as a coach happened. And that I started out originally in the career transformation, helping individuals transform. And then this realization that that organizations didn't have leader training that was effective. And for the most part, leaders were thrown into the deep end with no real sense of how to survive there. So that became a focus for me. And as I excelled in that space, I started working with whole teams, eventually with leadership teams, organizational culture. And that really evolved from that place of like understanding the pain points of a leader and their team and the interaction between those two, and how really everyone's showing up trying to do their best, and how the constraints that are put on people often make it hard for people to even observe other people as doing their best. So that evolved into the work that I'm doing now. And I think the experience of being in a number of different contexts and seeing a huge amount of teams in different contexts as well, in different cities and different, socioeconomic backgrounds, all kinds of different things. I was able to witness people as human beings. So we work at this really really human level, like what makes us all human, and how do we accommodate for that, and then create aspirational goals together, and then how do we lead in those environments. So that was sort of a long-winded answer of, for me, it was an evolution that started young and then turned into what I do now. So we work with organizations, Fortune 500, Fortune 100 organizations, and then we work with companies all the way down to 8-10 people, developing their capacity to lead and work effectively together.
Yeah, you hit on some really fascinating things to me. I think there is this distinct difference between what we sometimes see as leadership, and I think military is a great example of that, which is more of a command and control structure, top down. I tell you what to do and you do it. Versus what real leadership looks like. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned a word that I really find to be one of the most important things within good leaders, and that's trust, right? Mm-hmm. And trust goes both ways. And where I first really heard someone talk about this in a way that really resonated to me was actually Colin Powell, who is coming from that military background and yet talking about how when people trust you as a leader,
Mhm.
they will follow you and do all kinds of things that they normally wouldn't.
Yeah.
But then you also talked about trusting that people are trying to do their best, and I think that's something that is often missed
Mhm.
by people in leadership roles.
Yeah.
Almost everyone comes to work trying to do their best every single day, don't they?
Indeed. Yeah. And I think one of the things that I find interesting about the work we do is that, okay, so take the topic of trust, for example. It comes in parallel with psychological safety. So a leader is sort of positively motivated to create an environment of psychological safety and extend the offer of trust. In that case, then people will offer them trust in return.
Mhm.
They're more likely to offer them trust in return. So like the leader's role really is to curate that space. So I'll often say to people, there's a management is a job and leadership is a relationship.
Yeah.
And in relationships, we work to build trust and we work to build a relationship to house more trust. And what that does is creates a condition for like rapid feedback in the moment, for example. So you also mentioned the military and command and control style and like how that's sort of not necessarily good. But what's interesting that I've found is that you can create high psychologically safe, high trust, highly effective groups in command and control structures. And you can create it in non-traditional, more flat organizations. And you can create the opposite in both of those conditions as well. So like the structure doesn't necessarily determine whether the leader will be of high quality or not, but it can often make it a lot harder for the leader to obtain that position. And I think one of the benefits that a lot of people forget about the military is the military trains its leaders a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, it
Right.
does.
And it's like most organizations don't have a command and control structure, but then don't train their people. So it's like what we experience of command and control is organizations where the structure is supposed to do the work of what a leader should do. So they end up just managing and forgetting about the relationship piece completely and effectively creating a destructive environment in a way through no fault of their own.
Yeah, absolutely. I do feel like there's a lot that can be learned in the corporate world, if you will, from the way the military operates. There are certain things that just don't translate, but
Yeah.
there are a lot of things that can be really effective in implementing in your organization. And I think the people development that is
Mhm.
offered by military organizations is absolutely one of those things that you touched on.
Yeah. Well, I think you can even think of it from like the school system, the most successful school systems in the world, regardless of what year you look at, who had the highest grades, whatever metrics you look at, one of the common things amongst those school systems is always the amount they educate their teachers, the amount of
Mhm.
learning that goes on, the amount that the people who lead the groups are invested and encouraged to invest in their own learning and development. And I think it increases a person's capacity for difference. And I used to talk about this a lot, and I've been talking about it less lately, and it's just recently come back in my mind this capacity for difference. How much can you stretch your mind from what you believe to be true to what could be true?
Mm.
And if you're able to do that as a leader and show that you're able to stretch your own sense of what might be right in a situation, people are more likely to follow that. So, what does that lead to? That leads to more people being interested in different ways of approaching a problem. So, now just through your own behavior, you're starting to create the conditions for innovation, which is great. Group or team problem solving. It's like don't the antiquated like don't bring me a problem, bring me a solution. It's like, well, if I had a solution, it wouldn't be a problem to begin with. Like, so, you know, like bring it to the team, but then what does the team do with it? It's like that capacity for difference creates the space for dialogue and better problem solving.
Yeah. I wanted to talk to you about this kind of team innovation in particular, and how we go about. I mean, I feel like a lot of the people that listen to this podcast are involved in some form of innovation where they work, whether they own the company or they're working on the front lines or somewhere in between. They are focused on innovation.
Yeah.
And a lot of that comes in a team environment. But to really drive rapid innovation, what kinds of things need to be present in a team aside from just trust?
Well, I think to create psychological safety, which is a parallel to trust, you have to set the conditions for this. So we do some training around the leader's toolkit, which is a set of behaviors that have been identified to build this kind of environment. But to simplify it, it starts off with, does your team have a common story of what failure is for the team? Because if they don't, they will insert their own story about failure from their past. So you don't necessarily want that, because that might not be good framing for what you're up to. Because what failure is really will define how much you can deviate from your norm. So innovation is predicated by the need for failure and then the ability to be curious about it. So you have to start with this story. What do we deem failure? You know, if you're in a physical environment, it's like the only thing that matters is that everybody goes home the same. So how are we going to communicate about things that might prevent that from happening? You know, this one thing is the thing that matters to us most. So when it comes to a situation that's more cognitive and less physical, it's like, what is failure? Okay, well, if we lose, you know, and I worked with a sales team, for example, and I said, what is failure to you all? And they said, well, we don't see losing a contract as a failure. I said, okay, great. How many contracts until somebody gets fired? Because at some point, if you lose enough contracts, you're going to get fired. Yeah. So, you know, you're not going to fool me. There is a line. So what is that line? And it's like, oh, so what we have, what they ended up having was like this process that captured learning, because one failure wasn't a failure, it was an opportunity. Okay, great. And then they had all these sort of points along the way that would indicate to someone that they need to be learning and developing, or they would eventually no longer be part of the team. So it was way, way far down the line where somebody might actually be terminated. But what everybody had an agreement upon was that if they'd gone through that process, that both parties would likely be wanting to separate from each other. Great. So now getting fired is no longer the consequence for losing a contract. Great. So now they're free to try more things, free to collaborate more effectively. A lot of things started to shift in how they were communicating, which is the next thing I would discuss, which is, so you have the failure piece, create a common story about what we actually agree upon together is failure, and then interdependence. How do we want to be interdependent? How do we want to work together? When do we want to communicate? Over what channels? And if those channels don't work, how do we want to talk about that? You know, I see this commonly when people are working on documents like Microsoft Excel or PowerPoint, right? People will have a secondary channel of communication because it's too hard to communicate on one. Well, now is there an inclusion aspect? There's all these other questions that come up. So I would say interdependence is the next thing to identify how you want to work together, and then uncertainty. What is uncertain? What is certain? How do we want to be navigating things that change in an uncertain world? So I think those are the top three. I would say another one that's really high value is, and particularly for leaders to think about and discuss with their teams, is their role. what do you feel my role as a leader is? What do I feel my role as a leader is? Do we have a common understanding of what that looks like? Because often people are putting their leaders in a position and their leaders aren't really thinking that that's the position they should be holding in somebody's life. So having some agreement around what that looks like, then leaders can more effectively transition to a person who provides direction, direction, protection, and order, and accountability, and less micromanagement, for example.
Yeah. I wonder if, and I don't know the last time that you looked at a listing for a job description, but I wonder if you see a gap in, let's just start with job descriptions. And that could be an internal hire or an external hire. There are a lot of descriptions that say lead a team, and then they go into all these other things that you may be responsible for that don't have a lot to do with the team. What are your thoughts along that?
Well, I think you're kind of putting your finger on a problem that we see where, this idea of management as a job and leadership as a relationship. Management is task oriented, but if a leader has 40 hours worth of tasks in their week that aren't associated to getting the most out of their people, they're going to do the tasks because that's what they get paid for. That's where their KPIs sit, all that kind of stuff. And their team will suffer as a result of the quantity of tasks that are put on a leader's desk.
Mm-hmm.
So those kinds of issues, we see that all the time. A good friend of mine runs a tech firm, and she took over sort of this legacy style of making a lot of HR functions from the team leader's task, like their job, and it was just, these people didn't have the training for it, didn't have the interest in it. It took an unbelievable amount of time. And that whole time they were not leading their people. And on exit interviews, sure enough, what they wanted was a leader, not a manager. Because these people they're leading very capable people that don't need them to sit over their shoulders. And often what that leads to, those sort of, job descriptions that are filled with these sort of task-oriented type things, I think it's what it does is fills the leader's calendar with tasks. They don't have the relationships to lead effectively, so then they have to micromanage to backfill a lack of leadership opportunities. And this goes back to, like, nobody wakes up wanting to do that.
Right. Yeah, I see this in the contact center world a lot, particularly at those the frontline managers, whether you call them supervisor, team lead, whatever that title is, that their role is full of a lot of different tasks. And it can be really challenging for them to find the time reasonably to also lead their team and develop their people. And instead, they get exactly what you're talking about. They get their plates full and they spend their day micromanaging because really that's all they have time for.
Yeah, well, and I think that's exactly right. It's often what they find they have time for. And this is something that I find myself saying often, is that as you're developing your leader capabilities, your leadership capabilities, what ends up happening is it does take a little bit more time up front, but like anything, like life, like starting a business, like any kind of shift, if you're not willing to downgrade your life a little bit, you'll never get the life that you want. So it's like, as a leader, if you want to get to a place where leadership is easier, you have to invest in the relationships with your people and learn your style of engaging with that, because not every intimate relationship is different than relationship in a work context. And while you might develop more personal relationships with some people, what you really want to know is, how do they learn? How do they work best? How do they work best with others? How can you help? It's like such a simple phrase. How can I help? I'm here to support you and the team. Oh, amazing. But if you don't have the time in your calendar or the bandwidth to do that, And to say that sincerely, you're stuck.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I want to go back to this concept of failure. And I think
Mm,
in a lot of teams, when we think about particularly customer facing teams, a lot of times that failure is there are a lot of measures in place already, right? So we've talked about a lot of tasks that can
mhm,
get in the way of leadership, but I feel like the measures, which often reflect tasks, can get in the way of us being brave about redefining failure, because failure can mean not meeting the scorecard measures,
mhm,
objectives that are set out. So how do you go about within a team maybe that has that fear
mhm.
already kind of there? How do you go about changing the narrative of what failure looks like?
It okay, so it's really interesting, but I kind of want to use the framing of customer service to maybe pass this idea around a little bit, because in my mind there's no such, like, it's win or learn. There is no failure. Like I come from a family background of entrepreneurs, of pioneers, like just industry pioneers in several different industries, and that's kind of my family framing, right? And that's a very freeing space to come from, and that's not where everyone comes from. So how do you acquire that without necessarily having started from that position? And I think it comes from first reframing failure for yourself, but then also asking, when I think of a customer context, okay, so someone gets on a phone call and you've been given a script from legal that you have to say some portion of, but what that person really wants is to be heard. So is the question, something in the script that you should say, or is it, what I'm hearing is this?
Mhm.
You're listening at a different level for a possible outcome that's different. What I'm hearing you want is this. And what you're doing is taking something that has happened to them, or something that isn't happening for them that they expected to happen for them, and saying, what I'm hearing you really want is this other outcome. And listening into that provides a different framing. So, okay, so this is what's happened in the past. You want this. Now let's explore the gap.
Mm.
Because if we can understand where we're trying to go, the gap is the thing we're talking about, as opposed to the failure happening or not happening.
Yeah.
It's like, who cares? Really comes to, it's like, that happened. We can't undo these things. But if you listen intently, you can hear about, and sometimes you have to, provide people with a bit of a shoulder to cry on, because things didn't go well, and that's totally fine. That,
Yeah.
empathy is necessary. But I think, where is it that we're really trying to go? And how does this serve where we're trying to go, as opposed to getting in the way of it?
Yeah. I love the phrase, win or learn. That to me is a really great way to start with anything, whether you're starting with a business or you're starting in a frontline customer service role, and you're getting ready to take that first call or chat or email or whatever the case may be.
Mhm.
If you can keep that mindset
Yeah.
going, then you will see a lot of wins along the way and improvement, because you've maybe suffered some losses,
Yeah.
and that's become an opportunity to learn and
Yeah.
get better moving forward. And I think far too often we as humans get stuck up in this mode of I didn't succeed, and
Yeah.
look at that as a bad thing, as a failure, but a failure in a way that is couched in a negative light, like you didn't do a good job, or
Yeah.
whatever the case may be.
Yeah, well, and as you're speaking, I'm thinking, it's, what's interesting is that the win or learn mentality is really a bridge to learn or learn. It's like,
Mm,
regardless of failure or success, are you exploring the gaps between where you are and where you could be? What worked here? What do we really like about this? How do we repeat that? And it's like you can have a very similar conversation about success as you have about failure. And I think that's one of the number one ways to destigmatize failure, is to simply talk about it in the same framing that you might talk about a success. I had one client where I suggested to him, I think what your team really needs to do is separate success and failure, but frame the meetings in the same way. We're going to have a meeting on Monday or whatever, wins, successes, and learning opportunities, and a meeting on Thursday, frustrations, failures, helpful opportunities, and learning. And put them in two different camps, but frame them both under learning and get the team good at learning. And it completely shifted how that team interacted. All of a sudden, it was like every opportunity to learn was being capitalized upon, and they went from 0 to hero like really quick.
Yeah, it really is amazing too. I think not enough people spend enough time actually focusing on what they're learning from the things that are going well.
Yeah.
And what things can we take out of something that's going well and make it even better potentially? Or let's understand why this works so well. And are there ways that we can replicate this in other areas where maybe things aren't going as well, or, understand what the secret sauce is with this particular thing so that we can spread that around and continue to repeat it as well? Because that's the other thing. Like, if you're not celebrating that success often enough, people may forget that that is a success and that it works really well and that you should keep doing it.
Completely. Yeah. I mean, I love the phrase, I'd rather be lucky than good. But, and I like that as a sort of fun quip, but it's, what I would most like to be good at, what I can myself personally orient towards being trying to be good at, is learning. And unfortunately, particularly in North America, we come through a system up until, for the majority of our huge portion of our life, we have this singular focus of like passing a test and getting through. So we think that's what learning is. So we have this like broken frame around what learning is. And really, learning is to develop a deeper understanding of something. So if we're going to develop a deeper understanding of something, that's a good thing. Like, there's never any bad in that. And really what we need to get there is curiosity. So as a leader, can you demonstrate curiosity? Can you form good quality questions? Have you been practicing inquiry? So another practice that I'll often offer to leaders is just for 2 weeks, try removing why from your category, from your personal dictionary, right? It's like, use what and how. And this has two effects. One, it slows leaders down, because to do that is hard.
Yeah.
So you have to slow down, which is good. It demonstrates that you actually care about someone else. So you're slowing down. And as a result of that slowing down, your brain has time to formulate what you actually want to know more about. So now you have this higher quality inquiry, which is wonderful. And the other thing it does is it reduces the amount of defensive, neurochemicals that go off in somebody's brain. All of a sudden it's like cortisol, stress hormones, adrenaline. Okay, why? And now I have to defend my position. And now you're in this debate when you want to be solving it together, and leaders enjoy it much more, because it's like, well, now we get to do this together. It's not on their shoulders to solve this problem. There's two brains thinking together instead of one versus one. It's like very good, but this simple thing can start showing leaders a pathway to those kinds of conversations, as opposed to like, why did you do it like this? Because immediately, because they're in a position of power, the thing we think about is, how do I respond and not lose my job?
Yeah. I think this is a really powerful thing that is not talked about enough. And that is how you ask a question when you are working with someone that you're maybe working on developmentally, whether that's you're mentoring them or you're coaching them or whatever the case may be, the framing of a question is, to your point, asking why automatically throws up this barrier, even if the answer that you want, why linguistically makes a lot of sense to ask that question. That's what you're looking for, a reason, right? But when you change it and say, tell me about what happened when you said this,
Yeah.
right? Or right, the all of a sudden that different framing changes the way our mind starts to process that information.
Yeah.
And now we're kind of reliving a moment as opposed to trying to defend our decision in that moment.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think central to that is, what if leadership was easy? Management's hard.
It is.
Really, management is hard, but leadership is quite a bit more fundamental to our natural way of being than I think a lot of people give credit to. It's much more learnable than I think a lot of people think it is as well. There just has to be space for it. So, I had someone ask me, this is several years ago now, like, oh, you should write an article about what modern leadership is. And I said, well, I can't. And the guy said, well, why not? I'm like, well, because modern leadership and who we follow now is no different than who we followed 200, 300, 400, 500 years ago. We want to follow the same kinds of people, and we follow the people who believe something about us before we do. So the question is, do you get there by asking questions that seek more information? Like, why? Sometimes you might need more information. Can you give me a little more information on X, Y problem so that I can ask some better questions about this? Oh, sure. That's a really different frame than, why do you do it like this?
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's like so simple. And is a leader engaging in developing that side of themselves so they can ask better quality questions and create those conditions? And I think that's the gap, is that people really need to understand that it is a fundamentally different job than management, and work towards developing those skills that make them the kind of person that someone else wants to follow. But I do like the phrase, if you're ever bored of somebody, it's because you're not curious enough.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
Love that. So if you had to share one tip, something that's different than the things that we've talked about already today, something maybe that is low hanging fruit that is easy to at least start practicing and putting into place to work on implementing for someone in a leadership role who really wants to work on being a better leader. What's something that you think, hey, this is relatively, in the grand scheme of things, an easy thing that you can work on your own?
Yeah, 100%. So I think it's actually the same as the best piece of dating advice I've ever been given. Go write down, and I mean physically write it down. Don't type it out. Write it down with a pen and paper. The traits of a leader that you respect, that you aspire to be, and then go be that person.
I love that. I absolutely love that. It certainly makes you think deeply about why you are inspired by a particular person. And then once you can understand that, it kind of informs how you need to move forward.
Absolutely. Well, and it also provides a fantastic opportunity for this gap analysis. Okay, well, if this is what I aspire to be, am I being this person means, well, where am I not being this person? Okay, well, in my meetings, I'm not showing up curious. Oh, in my one-on-ones, I'm giving people feedback. It's like, why are you using your one-on-ones to give people feedback? What have you been doing in your conversations with them for the last 3 months? Oh, you want to have good relationships with people. That might be a value that you have as a leader. Those kinds of things, all of a sudden you have a framework to go, this is what I believe is possible if I have something to aspire to. And as soon as you can start building that framework for yourself and aspiring to it, you can start helping others do that kind of work too.
Yeah, absolutely. Neil, this has been a wonderful conversation. And I know that there may be some people out there that are thinking, hey, I'd like to have Neil come work with our team. If they wanted to do that, what's the best way that they could just get in touch with you, maybe bounce something off you and see
Yeah,
if they're a good fit?
absolutely. Easiest way to connect with me is through LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on there, post a lot of stuff on there. So I always am open to messages on there and respond pretty productively to people there. And then through our website, aristotleperformance.com, there's more information about what we do there and respond to inquiries through that as well.
Great.
And yeah, that's how we usually get started with people to help them out.
Well, as always, we'll make sure that all those links are in the liner notes so everybody has quick access to them. Neil, I gotta thank you for joining us here on Next in Queue. It's been a really great conversation.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me on, Rob. And I think that it's any opportunity I get to speak about leadership, I love that. It's we can never escape being human beings. And if leaders remember that, if team members remember that about their leaders, and they start realizing that team success is a team sport, and the leader is a coach in that context, it's much more fun, and all this serious stuff really can convert into a really good time. And I tell you, my team and we have a hell of a good time doing what we do. So it's possible for other people too.
Yeah, absolutely. Having a good time while lots of winning and lots of learning.
You know it. Awesome. Thanks a lot, Rob.
Next in Queue is brought to you by Happy To and is produced by me, Rob Dwyer. If you enjoy this podcast, please by all means subscribe and or rate this podcast in iTunes or your favorite podcast app. But more importantly, please tell just one person about this podcast. Word of mouth is the best way for people to discover new content. As always, thanks for listening.